Well, thank you, Richard, so much for taking time out of your day to help with my project. Could you maybe talk a little bit about yourself?
Name is Richard Easton. I grew up in Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. My father worked on the space program from 1952 to 1980. My day job is as an actuary, but I've written a lot about GPS, including the book I co-authored with Eric Fraser called GPS Declassified, and followed space just naturally, and am excited about the plans to land on the moon within the next 4 years.
It's so funny. We met at the North Houston Space Society. I've read your book. We've been in contact via Twitter and what have you, and I didn't know you were an actuarian.
Yep. We are, we, we know the price of everything and the value of nothing. So.
That's awesome. I heard it's actuarial science I was kind of interested in the mid 1990s because I was doing math and what have you. And at that time, I heard it as being defined as the ability to put like a price on future events or something like that.
Estimate uncertainty. It's like when I hear politicians say their reaction to COVID will be based on science. I say, well, the science is pretty complicated. I mean, if you want to tamp down on COVID, there are all sorts of secondary effects that they're probably not considering. So science has more uncertainty than they'd like us to believe.
Absolutely. I keep telling my children, be careful what you think you know. And I think that could be true to scientists too, is that, what you have is your best guess and you're constantly challenging and trying to improve that, but you're still trying to fit it to the facts. Some of it may be very confident, like some of the mechanics, for example, but then other is so complex, we're still trying to get into the nitty gritty of it, like how the brain is actually working.
Yeah, I mean the newest U.S. mission to Mars, the ULA rocket was so accurate that they didn't have to do their initial course correction. So like you say, orbital mechanics, we're pretty confident about. On the other hand, when they're trying to project asteroids, whether they're going to hit the Earth 40 years from now, that's a multi-body problem. And when you go out that far, small adjustments can have big effects. So.
Oh, exactly. And plus interactions with unknown things along that asteroid's path. If it comes into contact with something, you know, uh, uh, big enough, that could deflect it or change its course too.
Yeah, and adjustments early on can obviously the errors can multiply themselves. I mean, there was a wonderful BBC series on Apollo 11, and then they did one on Apollo 13. And of course, with Apollo 13, they were using the LEMS rocket to make course corrections, and it was totally different from how they projected, and the NASA people were worried that they kept on drifting out of the midpoint of the corridor to re-enter safely, and they had to make several corrections, but they were dealing with something that they had not simulated much, and they talked about how the LEM was on the opposite end from the service module that they normally would have used for corrections. So they were having to reverse everything, and it kept on drifting out of the middle of the corridor. And of course, it was, I think, a minute 27 seconds longer to regain contact with the command module than they'd estimated. In previous missions, they'd had it to the second. So, the people behind the last course correction were wondering, gee, did we do something wrong? So there are always uncertainties.
And just thinking about risk and uncertainties and kind of like your personal tolerance for risk, um, how safe would like a trip to space have to be before you would consider doing it yourself?
Oh, I mean, I know for the shuttle, they gave, ridiculously confident, like fatal, 1 in 50,000, which I know Richard Feynman, when he was on the Challenger committee, thought was preposterously optimistic. Um, I would say, it'd have to be at least, no more than 1 in 500, which I don't think they're anywhere close to that. So, but I'm not a John Glenn. I haven't been the first U.S. person into orbit. So at my age, I think there are a lot of people more qualified to go into space.
Yeah, that's an interesting actuarial question, especially as we look at maybe colonizing space. Does it
Mm-hmm.
does it make sense to send young people who are healthier and could probably survive it better, but at the same token, they might be sacrificing more of their life on the back end? Or does it make more sense to kind of prove things out with older people who kind of have experience and expertise, but also on the other side of it, just looking at it from a strictly gruesome actuarian side of maybe they have less life that they're giving up, and so um, it it would be better to prove it out with them. I was just kind of, how would you approach that problem as an actuarian?
Well, and I had 13 ancestors that I can trace myself to on the Mayflower, including the famous people like Miles Standish, John Alden, and Priscilla Mullins. But I'm also descended from John Billington, the Mayflower murderer who tried to pull an OJ and shot a man in 1630 and went traipsing out into the woods, figuring he'd have a good alibi. But alas for John, the guy lived long enough to say who done it, and he was hung about a month later. So I think in general, younger people, even though they have more of their life left, as long as you have a sufficient number of experienced people, younger people are going to tolerate the stresses so much better that obviously you wouldn't send an infant, but the whole question, if you're going to the moon or Mars, is what are the long-term effects of significantly reduced gravity? What the moon is about a sixth, and I think Mars is 37% or something of the Earth's gravity. And one thing that has frustrated some people about the space station is, they're in zero gravity and they haven't really tested a small, 1 or 2% of the Earth's gravity. Does that decrease your deterioration significantly? But I would think, of course, one thing about Mars is you're going to be a lot further away from the Earth than you were on the moon missions, where round trip, the signal took about 3 seconds. Mars, you're talking about minutes, or obviously if Mars is on the other side of the sun, you couldn't communicate directly. You need some other body to transfer your signals to. So the people going to Mars are going to have to be more self-reliant than was the case with the moon.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I mean, you were talking about just a little bit of gravity. I mean, when you think about such things as what do you call it? It's, um, s- when things settle to the bottom of like a container,
Okay,
sedimentation,
yeah,
or
yeah.
the transfer of hot air rising and cold air falling. I mean, that's one thing that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, is that an astronaut just floating in space is kind of filling their immediate surroundings with carbon dioxide that would normally be would kind of uh, waft
Sure.
upwards. But and
Yeah.
so having fans are like so key. But I'm kind of interested in I wonder what the minimum amount of gravity it is to get enough of the hot air rising, to be able to kind of keep an astronaut alive without constant having fans blow on them.
Well, and obviously exercise. I mean, um, on the space station, they lose a certain percentage of mass, and anything in terms of a small capsule sending people to Mars. Besides the claustrophobia, I think they'd find it very difficult to get enough exercise that they would be of any use. I mean, people have wondered whether, the rockets we're using today, which I think, I mean, obviously we have our launch windows in July and early August for the missions they just sent to Mars, and round trip of about 2 years with chemical rockets, whether you really need nuclear propulsion to make the whole thing much faster. Certainly doesn't seem like Elon Musk is working on that. So a 2-year round trip, and whether the initial mission to Mars might be to one of its moons, since I think the gravity well, it's much less of a challenge to land on one of the moons. On the other hand, if we're talking about gravity, 37% or so for Mars, Phobos and Deimos, I assume, are almost nothing. So I'm not sure about that, but you trade one advantage for another disadvantage. And I think we clearly, based on the Apollo experience, we can send people to the moon and set up a moon base. Dust will be a problem, but given that we did it from 1969 to 72, it's just a matter of will and cost. And like you said, safety. We are probably much more risk averse as a society today compared to 50 years ago. And the astronauts were willing to take that risk. They were, to begin with, test pilots. And whether our society will, and of course we also had the challenge of beating the Russians, but whether our society will tolerate significant death potential for the moon or Mars, it's hard to say. Certainly with COVID, you have people with different attitudes as to the risk.
Yeah, I think with like COVID, unless it's like affecting you individually. I mean, I guess it's our perception of risk we're so much biased towards our personal experience. Like if you had a house catch on fire, you're alert to way more fire hazards than somebody that's never ever experienced that. And likewise, if, like, COVID-19, if you actually have it or know somebody that's had it, you have a completely different perception than somebody who really hasn't been exposed, to that experience, I think.
Yes, or people at the edge of the spear, people in the infantry in World War II, totally different experience from people directing the war at the Pentagon. On the other hand, I read a book about, America mobilizing for war, and, the accidents in producing, manufacturing accidents were really high, and we tend to forget about that. And of course the astronauts, this isn't in terms of risk, but the astronauts all acknowledged that, 400,000 people sent those 12 people to walk on the moon. It was not just the astronauts and mission control. And by the same token, the things like what's made GPS such a success is the advance in computers, microprocessors, having a iPhone with GPS pre-installed. It's not just the system of 24 plus satellites. And certainly we have a lot of, you compare Apollo 11 with Apollo 12. Apollo 11, I think they were off by about 4 miles. And Apollo 12, they landed within 250 feet of the Surveyor 3. So, during those couple months between 11 and 12, they used the lessons of 11 to make their adjustments for variations in the moon's gravity much greater. And I think with the advances in technology, we certainly, even though, alas, we lost a lot of the secrets of the Saturn V, we still have the ability to do things much safer than they could 50 years ago.
And you mentioned we're a lot more risk averse now than we were in, say, the 60s. I was wondering what you think may have caused that.
Oh, of course, TV and the ability to see, it's one thing to see a Saving Private Ryan. It's another thing to have TV crews going in with the troops in 1944. So I think we can see things up front much easier. And they say ignorance is bliss. Well, ignorance may also lead people to being willing to take greater risks. One thing people said about NASA was a race between getting the technology to go to the moon and the increased bureaucracy of NASA. Who could win first, or who could succeed first. And of course, the problem is large organizations tend to exist to self-perpetuate themselves. And the difference between a SpaceX, where they're trying anything to save money, and a cost plus contractor, completely different incentives. And they lead you, my father, right after Sputnik was launched, he realized that the Soviets are soon going to launch spy satellites. And he came up with, and the existing tracking systems like the Minitrack that he worked on depended on detecting the signal from the transmitter and the satellite. And obviously a spy satellite will be quiet most of the time. So Eisenhower set up ARPA, now called DARPA, right after Sputnik, to foster innovation, avoid a space age Pearl Harbor. And my father proposed to them in February '58 what became the Naval Space Surveillance System, which had powerful transmitters on the ground, which would reflect off the satellite to receiver stations. So it didn't depend on detecting a signal from the satellite. He proposed that in February of '58. He got funding from ARPA in June, and they detected the first satellite in August. Now, they improved it over time, but it just shows you, when there's perceived to be a critical need, how much faster things can go. And not needing 10 people to sign off on it. One of the advantages SpaceX has is it's not a publicly traded company. So they can make their decisions quickly and they're using more, you're seeing it with the Starship, development in what is it, Boca Chica? I'm going to
That's it,
mispronounce.
Boca Chica.
Boca Chica, just how quickly they're moving. And I remember in 2015, I had a consulting job in Madison, Wisconsin, and I very much like a program called The Space Show. I've been on it a number of times, but they had an individual on it who said he didn't think that SpaceX would be able to land the first stage successfully because it had not been designed from day one. And it was, I think, December of 2015 that they did it the first time. And I don't know, what is it now, 60 times? Probably a bit off, but a driven company can do things that will amaze the scoffers. And I'm hoping Artemis, the problem with Artemis right now is it's dependent on funding from the Congress. It's possible SpaceX may land people on the moon before NASA does. But I'm excited that there are multiple avenues that can do it. And the cost of going to space is dropping down. It's not just SpaceX. You have a lot of other companies. And we may not hit 2024, but we're going to hit soon after that. And if you'd asked me a decade ago, again, I was born in 1955. So Apollo 17 was when I had just turned 17. And we've had, we haven't been out of low Earth orbit since then. And it's just exciting, the acceleration of pace that we're seeing now. And that it's not just NASA or the political chicanery. I mean, obviously, if we have a new administration, they're going to have their priorities. And if Trump is reelected, he still has at the moment to deal with the Democratic House. So you have many fingers in the pie, and things can be slowed down or canceled. Whereas with the private companies, we're talking now about private missions to Venus or Mars. So it's just exciting that there's so many more players and not just some congressperson, can stop the whole thing or can go with an inferior solution because it's a lot of jobs in wherever they're from. So I think we're in for an exciting next couple of years. And again, if we don't make 2024, I think we're going to make it soon after that. And multiple missions to Mars. I think there's still challenges, like I said, shielding from cosmic rays. There are a lot of issues going to Mars that are much more significant than going to the moon. But if we set up a lunar base, I think that'll help us in terms of learning things that will help the eventual Mars mission.
Yeah, I keep feeling like the 2020s are going to be the space exploration what the 1990s were to the internet. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you thought that was a fair analogy.
I think it is, hopefully without the crash of 2000. I think I don't see that as a problem, but the types of trends that we've got, it's interesting. The first time I was on the space show was with my father in 2008. And it was, I think, either that day, depending on, I know SpaceX was launching from Quadrolane, which I'm not sure, which side of the international date line it was on. But it was within 24 hours of when we appeared that they succeeded on their fourth try. And Elon Musk said he was about to run out of money. So it's amazing, just their ability to to get to orbit on or around September 28th, 2008. What's come out of that? I mean, eventually, if SpaceX had disappeared, somebody else would have been landing a first stage successfully, but that might have been delayed 5 or 10 years. So it's amazing at the beginnings how tight things were, and the blossoming we're seeing today. I mean, I agree with you. Space is suddenly sexy, and the people that were going into computer games or Silicon Valley, are suddenly interested in working for a rocket company or some ancillary aspect. I mean, obviously, you hear people say, without Wernher von Braun, we wouldn't have made it to the moon. Well, without the command service module, we wouldn't have made it to the moon. Without the lunar module, we wouldn't have made it to the moon. So it wasn't just von Braun. A number of people had to be successful. And what's exciting now is we're actually working on the different components to land people on the moon. So it's not just going to be an Apollo 8, where you go into lunar orbit, but we're working on the different aspects needed to land on the moon and hopefully set up a moon base.
And we have 3 teams building landers instead of just one. And one
Yes.
of those teams already delivered a mock-up to the Johnson Space Center for them to kind of evaluate the physical characteristics of it, the dimensions.
Yes.
It's kind of neat. So whenever you look out into the future, like 500 years, what does humanity look like? And specifically, do you think we're still on the Earth making these little trips out to places, or have we fundamentally expanded humanity beyond the Earth, and we actually have people who are actually born off of the Earth and people who are living their entire lives someplace else?
I'd say probably the latter, but the whole question, what do you need? What will happen for somebody living at 1/6 the gravity or 37% of the gravity? Do you need to take certain drugs? The adaptations to me are the thing that's, I don't think I have the ability to estimate that, project that accurately. But I clearly, people born on Mars, assuming we get through all the challenges, people born on Mars are likely to be fundamentally different. And eventually, whether it's through bioengineering or something, you will need different things to adapt to that radically different environment. And how quickly, whether it would be possible to have a 2001 mission, to Jupiter, I don't know. That's clearly the moon is within our reach. We've done it. Mars, more challenges, further away. Martian soil, is it something that humans can be adapted to, or is it something that they could go to Mars for short periods of time and then have to come back to the Earth? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, it's also kind of interesting to think with our bioengineering and computational stuff and understanding the brain, what will humans even be in 500 years,
Yeah. I mean, if, looking at, various people have said, you look at society today compared to 1950 or 1960, there are changes. You have computers in your pocket, but the flying car hasn't come yet. When I was growing up, there was a book called "You Will Go to the Moon," and that hasn't happened yet. But and in a sense, we jumped ahead of ourselves going to the moon. Kennedy had a political imperative after Gagarin was launched and the failure in Cuba of the Bay of Pigs. He needed something big to jump for. Probably a space station would have been a more reasonable starting point, but we managed to do it, even if it was 20, 30 years ahead of its logical time. And then we didn't see the need anymore, and it was so expensive and dangerous that we let it go for almost 50 years. But now, the costs are coming down, and people are being inspired again.
Now, about the inspiration, I think a prerequisite to inspiration is knowing of awareness. It's hard to imagine an event that people are unaware of inspiring people. And I've done about 260 of these interviews so far. And of that, probably about 50 of them actually knew we were going to the moon in 2024. In fact, I even had one person say, "Why is NASA keeping it a secret?" Which I think points to the way that we receive our news today and how that's changed since the 1960s.
Yeah, you can get both information overload, and obviously people tend to like things that reinforce their preconceived notions. I mean, I'm not immune from that. And of course, you have people that they're just struggling to get through the day. So it's easy for people who have free time like myself to say, gee, they ought to be more informed. Well, they're informed about the things that are absolutely critical to get them through the day. But it is amazing that such a small percentage of people would be even aware of the Artemis plans.
And I think a large part of it could be NASA's had many plans over the decades that have not fulfilled themselves. I mean, I think people are way more aware of, say, the astronauts going to International Space Station on the SpaceX rocket at the beginning of June or at the end of May than they are about the Artemis plans, just because it actually happened. And so I think, maybe as we start seeing real events happen to support the Artemis plans, besides just announcements and prototypes, maybe that will make people feel like it's worth the investment of finding out about it.
Yeah, that was something when I heard about your project, which I think is wonderful, but that I kind of wondered, well, gee, we haven't sent humans into space from the US since 2011. And like you said, you can go back decades, and Reagan, George H.W., George W. I mean, all the presidents that had grand ambitions, but other things got in the way, or a change in administration. Let's face it, Kennedy in late '63 was very worried about the costs of the Apollo program and proposed to Khrushchev making a joint. I mean, obviously his death was tragic, but his death may have led to Apollo being perpetuated. I mean, Lyndon Johnson was a big space fan, but also, the feeling that we had to do this for JFK. And had he been alive and in charge of it, who knows what might have happened. So the terrible event in Dallas may have led to Neil Armstrong stepping out on the moon. I mean, history has a way of going in directions we did not anticipate.
Yeah, it seems like that everything has in it the seeds of the opposite thing. Every good thing has some aspects of it that are potentially the seeds for bad things, and every bad thing potentially had seeds in it for good things.
Well,
And
there's a story. I think the king of Lydia was talking about fighting the Persians. So he went to the Delphic Oracle and asked about it. And Delphic Oracle said, if you attack Persia, a great empire will be destroyed. And so he did, and he lost. And, the story goes, he went back and Delphic Oracle said, well, you didn't ask which one. So, so um, the, like I said, SpaceX, I'm sure someone else would have come along if the fourth attempt to reach orbit in September of 2008 had failed. But still, people have an impact. And Elon Musk and other people have had an impact on potentially making the 2020s, as you said, a golden age of space exploration.
yeah, and it's each failure becomes the fertilizer for the next effort, which may lead to success. I was just thinking about SpaceX. Their McGregor facility actually was originally a Bell Aerospace test facility, which was I think it was Andrew Bell. He owns Bell Bank, BAEL,
Mm.
and so that facility had been built with the idea of having private space that failed, and then years later, SpaceX needs a place to test their rockets, and it's kind of like they already have a place to build on. So
Sure. Creative destruction. And they talked about for SpaceX, how you gave an example, how they reuse things, try to do things more efficiently. And again, if you're a big government bureaucracy, you don't have quite the same incentives.
absolutely. So I kind of also envision this project as being a time capsule for generations yet unborn. Um, I'm kind of envisioning 2100, you have this high schooler that lives on the moon who's been tasked with writing a report about what were people thinking before the new space age, which would be
Mm-hmm.
this time period. Assuming that that high schooler is looking at this interview, is there anything you would like to tell them or point out?
Um, well, it's we stand on the shoulder of the giants. I mean, whatever they're doing, people have created today, and hopefully they're laying the foundation for wonderful things in the future. So um, it's easy to go back in time. Um, my father was talking to me about his initial plans for his time navigation system from 1964. They're going to have ground stations sending time up to satellites. 64, he was talking about using atomic clocks. And the government set up in the 1990s selective availability, which distorted the civilian signal for GPS. And they quickly found a way around it where they'd use land beacons to tell you how much distortion there was in GPS. So they'd use land augmentations of GPS. And my dad said, gee, when he was thinking of it in 64, he did not envision that. So, people set up something with the technology of the day, and that leads to future advances building on that. So
I'd heard a story about like either an art museum or a science museum where they actually had a ball or some other thing that would attempt to stay in its place based upon the distortion, and so it would move around the facility. It's kind of like some type of kind of curiosity.
yeah, there. I think it's the end of the movie. The lady from Shanghai where they're in an illusion museum, and they're trying to shoot at each other, but they don't know where the other person is. Are they actually there, or is it a reflection of them somewhere else? And a hall of mirrors. So hopefully a lot of the mysteries of today will be, in 2009, I went to an event with astronauts in San Diego, and we had a video of Buzz Aldrin talking about the case for Mars. And afterwards, I'll not mention his name because he said it to me in confidence, but a well-known Apollo astronaut said, well, Buzz is leaving about 30 steps out, things we need to be able to solve before we go to Mars. But we're a lot further along, and it's Elon Musk may be underestimating some of those factors, but similar to the Saturn V, you needed the Saturn V to land people on the moon, and the fact that Saturn V worked meant that then the command service module, particularly after the Apollo 1 fire, and why did Apollo 8 go to the moon? Because the LEM was slow. They were behind schedule. So if you can solve one problem, that gives you the incentive to work on the other issues that are needed. And again, like you said, we have 3 different organizations working on the objects to land on the moon. So the inspiration from the ability to have cheaper rockets is leading us to work on those other issues to return to the moon that, as you said, programs have been canceled so many times that maybe the public is somewhat jaded.
Yeah, that's true. I'm really hoping that we stay on target with something close to 2024, because I'm committed to completing all these interviews to the end of 2024, and the conversation is going to become really, really goofy as those plans go away.
Well, and you need to find people to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. Used to, I was going up to people at coffee shops and on the streets and at the airports, but I don't think that's a wise idea given our current circumstances.
No, masks will be a problem.
Yeah, or even just interacting with people is a problem that you don't know.
Sure.
Yeah, so. Well, Richard, I really appreciate your time. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
No. Good questions, and I enjoyed the conversation.
Well, thanks. And if you know anybody else that's willing to have a conversation, I definitely could use them.
Okay, will do.
Okay, have a good rest of your day then.
Thanks.